The airport bustled like any other evening. Families hugged their goodbyes. Business travelers typed hurried emails before boarding, and children pressed their faces against the large glass panes overlooking the glowing runway. Flight 782, bound for a well-known international hub, was preparing for departure. To the untrained eye, it was just another aircraft lined up for takeoff. Another steel bird with rows of tired faces and eager hearts. Yet, in less than 3 hours, it would become the centerpiece of a story that 214 people would carry for the rest of their lives. The jet itself was a twin-engine wide-body aircraft, capable of carrying up to 250 passengers. Tonight, its manifest was nearly full, with 214 men, women, and children on board. The plane had a good record, modern avionics, trusted by airlines for reliability and safety. It had flown countless journeys without incident, and even the most frequent travelers among the passengers considered it a safe, familiar companion in the skies. But safety on paper does not guarantee safety in the sky, not when the weather decides to turn hostile. The crew behind the flight. At the controls was Captain James Renner, a seasoned pilot in his late 50s. He was known among colleagues as calm, precise, and never one to take unnecessary risks. His first officer, Daniel Morris, was younger, ambitious, and deeply respectful of the captain's judgment. Together, they had logged thousands of hours of flight time, though never together under conditions quite like the ones forming ahead of them. In the cabin, 7 flight attendants prepared for the evening journey. They smiled as passengers trickled in, stowed luggage, and buckled their belts. For many on board, these attendants were invisible, part of the background noise of airline travel. But before long, they would become the lifeline between survival and disaster. The 214 lives. Among the passengers sat a cross-section of humanity, a nervous first-time flyer, clutching her boarding pass like a talisman, a frequent business traveler, laptop still open until the flight attendant reminded him to shut it down. A child of 9 years old traveling alone, escorted on the plane with a badge that read, "Unaccompanied Minor." An elderly couple, holding hands tightly as they always did during takeoffs. Families on vacation, students returning home, and professionals chasing deadlines. Every seat carried a story. Every passenger had a reason for being there. None imagined that reason might soon become survival itself. Takeoff into the unknown. At 6:42 p.m., the jet thundered down the runway and lifted into the darkening sky. Lights flickered below, shrinking into pinpricks as the plane pierced through the first layers of clouds. The ascent was smooth, routine, comforting. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 782. We are expecting a flight time of just under 3 hours tonight. Weather at our destination is forecasted to be cold with light precipitation, but nothing that should cause concern. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your journey." Passengers exhaled, reassured. Conversations resumed, laptops reopened, and the hum of engines settled into the steady rhythm of travel. Meals were served. Children giggled at in-flight cartoons, and flight attendants moved gracefully up and down the aisles. The first signs. At 32,000 feet, somewhere over a stretch of dense cloud cover, the first subtle signs of trouble appeared. A faint shiver ran through the fuselage, almost imperceptible. A thin film of frost began clinging to the edges of the cockpit windows. Instruments reported a slight fluctuation in outside temperature, sharper than predicted. Captain Renner frowned, scanning the data. Ice wasn't uncommon, but the rapid formation was concerning. He adjusted the de-icing system, watching carefully as the anti-ice valves opened and hot air flowed across the wings and engines. Still, the system was working. There was no reason to alarm anyone. Not yet. Passengers unaware. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained one of comfort. The first-time flyer tried to distract herself with a movie, gripping the armrest at every bump of turbulence. The business traveler ordered coffee, typing notes into his presentation. The unaccompanied child colored pictures in a provided activity book. The elderly couple whispered softly, recalling their first trip abroad decades ago. Everyone trusted the plane, trusted the pilots, trusted the invisible systems designed to protect them from the unforgiving sky. The warning that didn't sound alarming. Tower to Flight 782, Be advised. Reports of heavier icing ahead in descent corridors. Recommend vigilance on approach. The message crackled through the headset. Captain Renner acknowledged calmly. He glanced at Morris, who nodded silently. They'd flown through worse, or so they thought. Renner tapped the logbook, recording the weather update. His voice, steady as ever, echoed through the cabin again. Ladies and gentlemen, we may experience some turbulence as we approach weather systems closer to our destination. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. To most passengers, it sounded like nothing more than a reminder. To the crew, it was a first thread in a web of danger slowly tightening around them, foreshadowing. Outside, the sky darkened further. Snow clouds thickened, swallowing the faint moonlight. The jet pressed forward, its engines roaring against the invisible drag of forming ice. On the ground, the destination airport was already battling icy runways and freezing fog. Emergency crews stood by, not knowing their busiest call of the night was on its way. Inside the plane, life carried on. Laughter echoed from row 18, where college students swapped stories. A baby slept soundly against its mother's chest. A man in row 27 quietly rehearsed a marriage proposal in his head, planning to kneel the moment they landed. None of them knew how close that landing would come to never happening at all. Closing of part 1. And so, the first half of the flight remained deceptively calm. Meals cleared, cabin lights dimmed, and the aircraft pressed steadily across the winter night. But as the descent drew closer, the weather outside worsened. Ice was no longer a thin layer on glass. It was becoming a frozen grip around the very structure of the aircraft. In less than an hour, Flight 782 would leave behind the illusion of routine. Its passengers would be thrust into a fight for survival that no one had expected when they boarded. 214 lives. One freezing storm. A landing that would decide everything. The first half of Flight 782 had been, by all accounts, uneventful. A little turbulence. A few bumps. Nothing beyond what frequent flyers would shrug off as just another winter flight. The cabin lights had dimmed after meal service, and the passengers settled into their private bubbles, reading, watching movies, dozing. Yet, above the clouds, forces were gathering that would soon strip away any sense of normalcy. The descent begins. At 8:52 p.m., the captain's voice cut through the quiet hum of the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent toward the airport. Current weather reports indicate some light freezing rain and reduced visibility, but our approach remains stable. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. The announcement was delivered in the calm, reassuring tone that Captain Renner had perfected over decades. But in the cockpit, his eyes told another story. Temperatures dropping fast. First Officer Morris noted, scanning the gauges. Anti-ice is on full, Renner replied, flicking a series of switches. Let's keep a close eye on the wings. The plane angled downward, slicing into thick, moisture-laden clouds. From the windows, passengers could see almost nothing but darkness, streaked occasionally with flashes of lightning in the distance. The jet was descending into a storm unlike any they had anticipated. The weather turns violent. At first, it was subtle. A faint tap-tap against the windows, the sound of sleet beginning to strike the fuselage. Then it intensified, transforming into a steady barrage of freezing rain. Passengers looked out into the void, where the wing lights revealed the unmistakable sheen of ice forming across the metal. The turbulence followed. A sudden jolt sent cups rattling on tray tables and jolted passengers upright in their seats. Overhead compartments rattled. Somewhere in the back, a child began to cry. The seatbelt sign chimed. Flight attendants, already braced in their jump seats, exchanged quick glances. They'd flown through storms before, but this one felt different. Mechanical strain. In the cockpit, alarms began their chorus. Engine anti-ice struggling, Morris said, his voice tight. Renner leaned forward, his hands firm on the controls. Keep it steady. Monitor airspeed. The wings, designed with heating elements to ward off ice, were struggling to cope with the sheer volume of frozen precipitation. Frost crawled across the cockpit windows, narrowing the pilot's view to a dim, shifting glow of runway lights somewhere far ahead. The icing isn't keeping up, Morris muttered. Renner's jaw tightened. We'll ride it through. We can't climb, fuel's tight. Our best bet is to get her down. The autopilot beeped in protest, sensors giving conflicting readings. The captain disengaged it, taking manual control. The plane responded sluggishly, like a creature wading through molasses. The cabin atmosphere. Passengers could sense a shift. Conversation stopped. Silence spread, broken only by the occasional cough or whimper. The nervous flyer from earlier clutched her armrest, whispering prayers under her breath. The businessman, pale now, closed his laptop and shoved it into the seat pocket. In row 14, the child traveling alone hugged the stuffed animal tighter, eyes wide as the plane rocked. A flight attendant crouched beside her, buckling herself in while still managing a reassuring smile. The elderly couple held hands so tightly their knuckles whitened, murmuring words of comfort only they could hear. The storm outside had stripped away the illusion of safety inside. Everyone felt the difference. The freezing point. Tower, this is Flight 782. We are on approach, Renner radioed. His voice was steady, professional. We're experiencing moderate to severe icing. Requesting priority landing. Flight 782, roger that. Came the reply from air traffic control. You are cleared for immediate approach. Runway is being treated, but conditions remain icy. Emergency services are on standby. The word emergency was not one pilots wanted to hear before landing. At 3,000 feet, the situation worsened. Warning systems flared red across the cockpit. Stall warning active, Morris called out. The plane shuddered violently, nose dipping before Renner pulled it back. The engines roared in protest. Inside the cabin, passengers screamed. Drinks spilled. A suitcase tumbled from an overhead bin, narrowly missing a passenger's head. The child in row 14 cried out as the lights flickered. The PA crackled. Renner's voice came through, strained but calm. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We are experiencing turbulence. We will be on the ground shortly. But the truth was far more dire. The aircraft was fighting for its very ability to stay in the sky. Faces of fear. Every soul on board wore fear differently. Some prayed silently, lips moving without sound. Some stared straight ahead, frozen, unable to process what was happening. Parents clutched their children. Strangers reached for each other's hands. One man muttered, "We're not going to make it," until his seatmate hushed him with a sharp glance. In that moment, all differences dissolved. Business class, economy, first-time flyers, seasoned travelers. All 214 were united by the same creeping dread. Cockpit tension. The runway was in sight now, a glowing strip in the icy fog. But between the aircraft and the ground lay forces that didn't care about human lives. Speed's dropping, Morris said, voice sharp. Compensate with thrust, Renner barked. His hands moved rapidly, pulling levers, adjusting flaps. Hold her steady. The stall warning blared again, a shrill sound that could chill the blood. Stall, 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 the system screamed. Renner pushed the nose down slightly, balancing on the razor's edge between recovery and disaster. For a heartbeat, the jet seemed to hang in the air, neither climbing nor descending, trapped between physics and willpower. Then, with a gut-wrenching lurch, it dipped again toward the frozen earth. Section closing. Gasps filled the cabin. Some passengers screamed. Others clamped their mouths shut in horror. The plane rattled so violently it felt as if bolts might shear loose. Through the frosted windows, the runway grew larger. Salvation or doom, no one could say. Inside the cockpit, sweat dripped down Renner's temple as he muttered under his breath, almost to himself, "Come on, girl. Hold together. Just hold together." 214 lives depended on whether the aircraft would obey. The storm had no mercy. Flight 782 plunged through the freezing darkness. Every shudder of its frame a reminder that human engineering was being tested to its limits. Inside, fear had become the only universal language. Some screamed, some prayed. Others clung silently to armrests. But up front in the cockpit, the true battle was raging, one against both nature and the clock. Cockpit chaos. Captain Renner's hands gripped the yoke, so tightly his knuckles blanched white. Sweat ran down his temples despite the freezing air that pressed in around the cockpit windows. The stall alarm blared again, shrill and relentless. Speeds decaying. First Officer Morris shouted, "I see it. Nose down a fraction, more thrust." Renner snapped back, forcing the plane's engines to roar louder. The aircraft lurched, its nose dipping before Renner corrected it, bringing the jet back into a precarious glide. It was a balancing act on the edge of physics. Too much nose down, and they'd crash short of the runway. Too much nose up, and the jet would stall completely, falling like a stone. The radio crackled. "Flight 782, you're cleared for immediate landing. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Winds gusting at 25 knots. Runway temperature below freezing." Morris shot Renner a look. Runway's an ice rink. Renner's jaw clenched. "We don't have a choice." The jet was flying less like a precision machine and more like a wounded animal, groaning with every adjustment, as if protesting its fight against gravity. Inside the cabin, in row after row, fear carved itself into human faces. The nervous flyer from earlier now wept openly, her fingernails digging into her seat's fabric. The business traveler, who had once looked annoyed by delays, now clutched his briefcase as though it might shield him from fate. The child traveling alone sobbed into her stuffed toy while a flight attendant wrapped an arm around her, whispering reassurances even she didn't believe. The elderly couple pressed their foreheads together, whispering prayers they hadn't uttered in decades. Above them, the cabin lights flickered as the jet jolted violently. Overhead bins burst open, luggage tumbling into the aisles. A heavy bag struck a man on the shoulder, and he cried out in pain, but no one dared move to help. Everyone was locked into their seats by terror and the command of the seatbelt sign. A mother shielded her baby with her body, murmuring lullabies over the shriek of the engines. Strangers who had never spoken before held each other's hands tightly, suddenly united in a bond forged by survival instinct. The flight attendants stand. The flight attendants, strapped into their jump seats near the galley, exchanged quick glances. Their training had drilled into them calmness under crisis, but no amount of practice could mask the raw fear on their faces. Still, their voices rang out in unison as the plane pitched sharply. "Remain seated. Keep your seat belts fastened. Head down, stay down." Their calm broke only when the jet dipped violently, sending a drink cart smashing across the galley. One attendant clutched her rosary under her uniform while keeping her voice steady, repeating the brace commands over and over. The human side of terror. In moments of life or death, humans reveal their truest selves. On Flight 782, those truths emerged raw and unfiltered. A man who had scoffed at turbulence earlier now whispered apologies to the stranger beside him for snapping over armrest space. A teenage boy held his younger sister, telling her stories about superheroes, his own voice trembling even as he tried to sound brave. A woman pulled out her phone, her hand shaking, typing a final message. "If I don't make it, know I love you." She hit send before the signal disappeared. Some passengers clasped hands across aisles, an unspoken pact that if they perished, they would not do so alone. The storm outside was relentless, but inside, humanity fought back in the only way it knew, through connection. The near disaster. At 1,200 feet, the worst moment struck. The stall warning screamed again, louder than before. "Stall, stall, stall," the mechanical voice echoed. The plane lurched left, its wing dipping toward the ground. Passengers screamed as the cabin tilted, drinks and belongings sliding across the floor. "Bank angle, bank angle," Morris shouted. Renner gritted his teeth, yanking the yoke. "Not today, damn it." With desperate precision, he deployed partial flaps, just enough to regain some lift without overloading the ice wings. The engines thundered, straining to hold altitude. For a terrifying moment, it felt as if the jet hung frozen in the sky, defying gravity by sheer willpower. Then, slowly, agonizingly, it leveled out. A collective gasp filled the cabin, followed by a silence so heavy it felt physical. Some passengers sobbed in relief. Others merely sat frozen, too terrified to believe they'd survived that moment. Communication with the tower. Flight 782. Altitude is unstable. The tower's voice came urgently. Can you continue approach? Renner exhaled sharply, never taking his eyes off the horizon. We don't have the fuel to go around. We're bringing her in. Clear the runway. The tower operator paused and replied, Runway is yours. Godspeed, 782. It wasn't protocol to say such words, but the controller knew this was no ordinary landing. This was survival, measured in feet and seconds. Passengers faced mortality. As the runway grew closer, reality hit the passengers like a wave. For many, the thought of death was no longer abstract. It was immediate, tangible. A woman in row 9 clutched her necklace, whispering names of her children back home. A man in row 21 broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, shoulders shaking. Others simply closed their eyes, as if surrendering to whatever came next. The cabin filled with whispered prayers, desperate apologies, and the raw silence of people realizing they might never step on solid ground again. Section closing. The ground loomed beneath them, blurred by ice and fog. The runway lights blinked weakly through the haze. In the cockpit, Renner's voice was hoarse but steady. Brace for landing. In the cabin, flight attendants shouted the words that sealed the truth of the moment. Brace. Brace. Heads down, stay down. 214 lives hung suspended between the frozen sky and the frozen earth, teetering on the knife's edge of fate. The storm had stripped Flight 782 down to its rawest test. The jet was more ice than steel now, its wings coated in frost, its engines wheezing against the weight of freezing rain. The passengers had accepted what most never dare to face. Death was no longer a distant concept, but a shadow pressing against their cabin walls. And then came the words no one forgets, shouted to the aisle in unison by the flight attendants, voices shaking but strong. Brace. Brace. Heads down, stay down. 214 lives bent forward in silent obedience. Moments before impact, the cockpit was a blur of lights, alarms, and human willpower. Speed 135, dropping. Morris barked. Hold her steady. Keep those wings level, Renner ordered, eyes locked on a faint strip of runway that flickered to the fog like a promise just out of reach. The stall alarm screamed again. Ice fought to drag the jet down. The engines groaned, straining at maximum thrust. Outside the windows, freezing rain turned the world into a shimmering nightmare. Inside, it was reduced to a single question. Could the jet stay aloft long enough to reach the ground? The runway lights loomed larger. At 400 feet, the jet shook violently, buffeted by crosswinds. Renner's teeth clenched. His hands moved with mechanical precision. Every muscle in his body focused on one act, keeping this aircraft alive for another second. Come on, he muttered, voice barely audible. The impact, with a bone-rattling screech. The wheels touched down, not gently, not gracefully. It was a slam, steel meeting frozen asphalt at impossible speed. The cabin erupted in screams. Oxygen masks jolted loose from overhead panels. Overhead bins burst open entirely, scattering bags like shrapnel. The tires skidded uselessly on the icy runway, failing to grip. Sparks burst from beneath the fuselage as the brakes locked. The jet fishtailed violently, swerving left then right. Reverse thrust. Morris yelled. Renner slammed the controls. The engines roared in reverse, belching hot air against the ice-slick tarmac. The passengers felt their bodies thrown forward, held back only by seat belts. Cries of terror mixed with silence, so deep it could only come from shock. The jet screeched across the runway, metal grinding against ice. Sparks and smoke filled the night. For a heart-stopping moment, the left wing dipped low, threatening to catch the ground and flip the aircraft entirely. But then it steadied. The aircraft slid, groaned, and finally, with a final violent jolt, came to a shuddering halt halfway down the runway. Frozen silence. For a moment, there was nothing. No alarms. No shouts. Just silence, broken only by the sound of sleet hammering against the fuselage. Passengers sat frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Some sobbed uncontrollably. Others sat in stunned quiet, gripping the hands of strangers. A baby wailed in the back, and that cry, piercing and raw, was the first signal that life remained. Captain Renner's voice came over the PA, trembling but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are down. Remain seated. Help is on the way." Emergency response. Outside, emergency lights blazed across the icy runway. Fire trucks and ambulances sped toward the crippled jet, their sirens muffled by the storm. Crews leapt into action, spraying foam across the slick tarmac in case of fire, battling both the weather and the clock. Inside, flight attendants unbuckled and sprang into action. "Leave your belongings. Head to the nearest exit," they shouted, voices hoarse but commanding. Emergency slides deployed, hissing as they inflated, and instantly coated in ice. Passengers slid down, some stumbling, others crawling across the frozen runway, clutching one another in disbelief. 214 lives spilled into the night, their shoes slipping on ice, their breaths visible in the freezing air. Some kissed the ground, some hugged strangers. Some simply stared up at the massive silhouette jet, unable to believe they were alive. Survivors' emotions. The nervous flyer who had wept through the descent collapsed to her knees, sobbing in gratitude. The businessman clutched his briefcase, but then let it fall onto the runway, realizing in that moment it no longer mattered. The child traveling alone was carried by a firefighter, her stuffed toy still clutched tightly in her tiny hand. She cried for her mother, but she was safe. The elderly couple held each other, tears streaming down their faces. "We're still here," the man whispered to his wife, his voice shaking. "We're still here." Across the tarmac, people who had been strangers only hours earlier embraced like lifelong friends. Survival had bonded them in ways words never could. The captain's burden. Inside the cockpit, Renner sat motionless for a long moment, his hands still on the controls. His chest heaved with heavy breaths. He had faced death before in simulations, in drills, in training. But this had been real. Morris touched his shoulder. "We did it." Renner shook his head slowly. "No, the plane did. And luck. We were 1 second from not making it." He was the last to leave the aircraft, walking the aisle one final time to ensure no soul had been left behind. His boots echoed in the empty cabin, past the abandoned bags, past the dropped phones, past the chaos left in the wake of survival. Only when he stepped onto the icy runway did he allow himself a breath of relief. Aftermath. The official reports would later state it plainly. Severe icing beyond forecast. Anti-icing systems overwhelmed. Crosswinds complicating an already dangerous landing. Miracle survival, 0 fatalities, though dozens suffered minor injuries. But for the passengers, reports and statistics didn't capture the truth. What they remembered was the silence before the landing, the screams as the plane skidded, the shock of stepping onto ice still alive. They remembered strangers' hands, whispered prayers, and the realization that life is far more fragile than we admit when boarding a flight. Reflections. Some passengers never flew again. Others returned to the skies weeks later, determined not to let fear control them. For all, the memory of that night lived on. The child traveling alone would grow up to tell the story for decades. The night she flew through frozen death and came out stronger. The businessman would admit, years later, that the night cured him of chasing work above all else. The elderly couple would tell their grandchildren, "We were given more time." As for Captain Renner, he retired 2 years later. When asked about Flight 782, he would simply say, "We landed because the plane wanted to, and because 214 people believed it had to." Closing line. On that frozen runway, 214 lives brushed against death's cold hand and walked away forever changed.